All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Buddy Walk with Jesus. As always, as we get started, we want you guys to know two very important things: that you are prayed for and you are loved deeply. As always, a big hello to the entire community, those of you that are just picking up with us, and those of you that have been walking with us through Matthew along the way. And as always, if you are finding benefit and finding blessing in walking through Matthew with us, go ahead and share the show with somebody. Let people know what we've got going on here as we continue our journey. So I want to crack right into it because we have a lot to talk about. We are picking up with Matthew 19. Now, we are going to be talking about one of the more divisive and controversial topics, really in Christendom, but specifically as it pertains to the gospel accounts. And this is one that has a way of drawing sides and has a way of eliciting a reaction, good, bad, or indifferent. Now, I will say that, I've considered multiple angles in which to approach this from. I've considered how in depth I wanted to go when teaching about divorce. And the reality is, guys, I think the best way to tackle this is for us to not go outside of the text. Let's talk about the text. Let's talk about what's happening here and what Jesus is saying. So as we explore into chapter 19, I really counsel you guys, try to just be present. Try to be present in this moment, in this conversation, rather than trying to enter into this with the expressed intention of proving your position right or something along those lines. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and crack in Matthew chapter 19, starting at verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." Okay, we need to stop there because so much was already said right from the beginning. So this isn't the first time that we have seen the Pharisees attempting to trap Jesus. And they're asking him a very specific question, right? That's one of the first pitfalls that tends to happen when this conversation comes up, is thinking that this is a general statement or general question about divorce as a whole. It's not. Divorce is far from being new to controversy. In Jesus' day, it was still a controversial topic. Generally speaking, there were two main schools of thought that centered around the two biggest proponents of the particular schools of thought. The first was the school of Rabbi which was essentially a more strict and unpopular point of view on the matter. The second was the school of Rabbi Hillel, a more relaxed and subsequently popular view on divorce. So we need to set the table for talking about this with how the Jews of the day would have viewed marriage and viewed this topic in order for us to be able to articulate what's really happening here and the deeper nuances of this conversation. Among the Jews of Jesus' day, marriage was kind of like a sacred duty, right? If a man was unmarried by the age of 20, except to concentrate on studying the law, in that culture, he was guilty of breaking God's command to be fruitful and multiply. They actually would view a man as lessening the glory of God on earth by not having children. So we see that this ancient command to be fruitful and multiply was taken and co-opted into a man-made rule and taken out of its context. Again, there's nothing new under the sun. So the idea here is Jews of that day had a high ideal of marriage, but as many of us already know, a rather low view of women. A woman was bought or more or less regarded as property at this point in time. And moreover, property that could be dismissed basically at a whim. And this high ideal coupled with low view invited compromises and some damaged way of thinking into this idea of how they processed marriage and the marriage relationship. The key to understanding where the divide is and what exactly the Pharisees are getting at with all of this is to go back to what the Pharisees asked. Again, let's not bring a modern interpretation into it. Let's take what it says for what it says. Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Now, both main ways of thinking both knew that divorce centered around this concept of uncleanness. And they both understood that the Mosaic law gave permission in Deuteronomy 24:1. So I'm going to go ahead and read that off real quick. So that way we are working under the same framework. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. Now, that word uncleanness can be found in your Strong's 6172. It is the word erva, which is defined as nakedness. And now, the thing here is that it has two different types of translations: bare indecency, indecent nakedness, but also shame. And so there's a literal interpretation of this, but also a figurative interpretation of this, which you're going to see the two main schools of thought centering around those two different ways of interpreting that word. In the case of the mode of thinking that came from Rabbi Hillel, a man could divorce his wife for really any reason. If she spoiled his dinner, if she spoke to other men, if he found other women, a different woman to that he liked more, or that was more attractive, or something along those lines. So basically for any reason. Whereas the school of Rabbi Shammai understood that uncleanness meant sexual immorality, and that was the only valid reason for divorce. So essentially, what they were trying to do is trap Jesus into choosing one rabbinical statement over the other, or one rabbinical teaching over the other. And so what we're going to see next is Jesus pivot to quoting specifically scripture in how he responds, rather than reaching for a rabbinical teaching. He starts off by quoting from Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So Jesus is indicating first that God made men and women different, and that God joins them together in marriage. Thus, Jesus is asserting God's authority over marriage, not man's authority. So he's going back to the scriptural foundation of marriage and makes it plain that the two are joined together as one flesh, which most of the time we hear referred to in the sense of it being a metaphor for the sexual union of a couple. But it goes well beyond that. There's a spiritual component to that. There is something that extends far beyond the man-made regulations and rules and aspects and physicality of it. Though the man's union physically with woman is absolutely part of it. This is a deeper and broader concept than just that, which is conveyed in the Hebrew, because in the Hebrew thought, this would have extended to the entire nature of the person, not just the fleshly aspects of the person. Ideally, that unity of marriage would encompass the entire nature. So we're getting at a unity of soul and spirit, in addition to the physical aspects of what we're talking about. This also would prohibit polygamy. It shows that that it's God's intention from the beginning for it to be one and one, not one to many. So the first part of what Jesus is getting at here is to state that there is a spiritual binding before God that takes place in marriage, right? That's what that word joined together, that phrase joined together, is 4801 in your Strong's physiognomy. I never claimed to be a linguistics expert, so have some grace. I probably mispronounced that. But it means to yoke together, to unite. Properly, jointly yoked, paired together, when God joins two people together for one purpose. And so, among the ancients, actually, when people were newly married, they would actually physically put a yoke on their chains and chains on their neck and on their arms to show that they were one. So there was a physical aspect to representing what that looks like. All right, so let's pick back up with the text. Starting at verse 7. They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Okay, so here is where things tend to get off the rails when we talk about these things. This is usually the point where a lot of controversy starts to crop up, because as a general state of thought, this is where a lot of the various positions start to stem from, of perpetual adultery and different things like that. So we're seeing that it wasn't that God commanded divorce where there was uncleanness. Like that's the misconception that's being fought against here from Jesus, right? Because that's the misconception that they're bringing it in. There was even a statement that would go around a rabbinic saying of that day: if a man has a bad wife, it's a religious duty to divorce her. So again, we're already working off of a misunderstanding and a misconception of what all of this looks like in execution, which the modern context is far from the first context of having the wrong beat on the sanctity of marriage. This is something that has been going on for generations, for centuries, right? So it wasn't that God commanded it, it's that it was permitted through Moses. There is a difference, and Jesus notes that. The Pharisees thought that Moses was creating or promoting this concept, but in actuality, all he's doing is putting guardrails in place. He's controlling what this looks like and trying to give a measure of parameter to this concept of writing a divorce certificate. And because this was never commanded but permitted by God under certain circumstances, it's being permitted because of the hardness of human heart, right? It is man's fault that all of this is happening, right? So here Jesus is essentially stating, this is the ideal, and this is what God permitted when humans get in the way, when human sin and hardness of heart gets in the way and makes the ideal unattainable. Okay, so now that we've covered all of that, there are a couple of words that we need to discuss here, so that way we can get a full picture of the heart of God that is on display through Jesus, because I think we get lost in the minutia of a lot of this stuff. There's a word that is used here, except for sexual immorality. Sexual immorality is 4202 in your Strong's, and it's porneia. Yes, it is the root of words like pornography or pornographic. And it means fornication, idolatry, and properly a selling off or surrendering of sexual purity, promiscuity of any or every type. Now let's roll back the clock here, because we covered in the Sermon on the Mount what the parameters of lust actually is and what that actually looks like as it pertains to the kingdom and God's perspective on that. Matthew 5, starting at verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So we're seeing that all of this is on a spiritual level. All of this is at a mind level. This is not just as simple as stating, okay, is this specific act sexual immorality? Is this specific thing this? And drawing all of those lines in the sand and trying to define the specific parameters when we are given what these parameters are. And that's what is being gotten at here. That this is Jesus fighting against what humans have made to be man-made parameters that have lost sight of the true intention of what God is getting at when he's given us these things like marriage, things like sex, all of these relationships and all of these things. And so we get lost in the specifics of, well, what constitutes this? Where's the parameter? You know, we don't want to really admit it, but it's almost like it's out of a place of, I want to see how far I can go. But he's talking about how these things are a product of the hardness of heart. And the reality is that a lot of the modern versions of this argument tend to stem from what constitutes immorality. What constitutes that sexual immorality? And trying to find where that line is, it would seem, is carrying the wrong perspective into the situation. And a lot of where the arguments of the rest of this verse tend to lie is what makes it allowable and what does it mean to say that a person commits adultery. And again, bringing in Jesus's words from Matthew 5 really matters when interpreting this, because at a heart level, you've already stepped out on that relationship if you even lust. So it's not just a matter of the physical act. It has happened on a heart and spiritual level far before that. And also, the word porneia isn't just about, to put it into our modern context, it's not necessarily a two-way thing. That's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily need to be a two-player game, guys. And I'm using guys in the general sense. Anybody listening to this. I'm not just trying to single out one or the other or anybody, because this is true for all of us. So let's not get lost in the specifics. Let's get down to the heart of the matter. And so when we're unpacking this, we need to look at the idea that Jesus is clear about the isolated sin of adultery. But we also need to be clear about the nature of God, that no man shall perish. And nowhere in this does it suggest that there is some kind of perpetual nature to this. That there is an act that happens. There is the act of adultery. And if we're just waiting on, well, there was no sexual intercourse, so then none of this matters. Then all of this isn't biblical. And now you're entering into a perpetual. I understand all of the arguments, guys. And I understand that for some of you, I would wager that there are some of you that were hoping that I would come down hard on one side or what have you, but I want to focus on what the Bible is saying, because when you talk about this, there's now then a whole section of this that people bring in with Paul and all of this kind of stuff, but I'm trying to focus on the words of Jesus. And if we understand the heart's intention of this, you understand that this was not Jesus trying to give you a specific out or a specific way of doing things or something along those lines. It's to express the heart of God. And so when we take his teachings, we cannot divorce them from the rest of his teachings and what he says about the nature of God, that God's preferred will is that no man shall perish. And so when we take this into consideration, we need to understand that the grace of God is still true even in this taboo and disgusting conversation. And by disgusting, I do not mean the people, I mean the fact that humans ruin something that God has given us. And that's uncomfortable. I get that this is uncomfortable. I get that this makes people squirm and that it's easier to come down hard and to have a specific stance and all of that kind of stuff than it is to sit in the realities of what all of this looks like, and to try and unpack that. But if we put this in the context of how God works within sin, then we can see very clearly that Jesus is getting at with what he's saying, that act has happened, that the hardness of heart and the evidence of sin has dissolved this. And so then what happens next is what God has given permission for based on man messing it up. Now, mind you, this is not carte blanche freedom. We can't then turn around and say, oh, then yeah, anytime, whatever happens, then we can just do this. No, then we've entered back into that concept of for any reason. So it's a perspective thing. If we're so focused on this part over here about the parameters of divorce, then we're not focused on the sanctity of marriage. So it's not a carte blanche freedom to go off and, if something has gone wrong, then I have now permission and ability to be able to write a certificate of divorce. It's a matter of here's God's view on all of this. And here are parameters, and here is what is meant in the heart behind all of this stuff. And so carrying all of that into the context of the kingdom, where God's authority is the highest authority, means that we don't have the permission to walk around stating that so-and-so is in perpetual adultery, so they're going to hell. They're a heathen. I'm going to hold back on them because they've gotten a divorce. All of that stuff matters, guys, within its full and complete context. And that should inform how we operate with one another. That I know is difficult. I want to be real about that. I want to be authentic about that. And my job as the one that's in front of the microphone teaching and all of that is to teach you guys well. By the grace of God, I have been given a platform to teach you guys. And so as your teacher, it is my job to just articulate what's here and not bring in a man-made perspective and a man-made teaching on all of this, that this is what Jesus was getting at. And it is my prayer that all of this stuff leads you back to the heart of God and not to having more ammunition for a particular stance or opinion on all of this stuff. So the application layer of all of this, that application portion, guys, is to understand, one, that we can't add in things that don't belong in the conversation. Two, this is not a license to condemn other people. As humans, we're going to have our preferences. We're going to have the things that we agree with. We're going to have the things that we disagree with, so on and so forth. But judging a person of where they're at with God and this and that is exactly the kind of thing that the Bible very specifically, Jesus very specifically speaks against. And so I just want to convey that we take this whole thing a bridge too far when we make ourselves the police for what is okay and what is not okay with all of this. That ultimately, yes, there are biblical standards and we need to understand what those are and what those aren't, but it's our job to understand that and not to add our own flavor on top of it based off of how we see it and then condemn people based off of how we see it. So I want to follow up with the rest of this particular section. The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it." So essentially, they're stating that they understand that this is a big deal and not something that should be taken lightly. And if that's the case, then maybe it's better not to marry. And so Jesus uses the analogy of the eunuch. The term eunuch was used figuratively in this case for those who voluntarily abstain from marriage. And he gives the three kinds. And this is used to recognize that for some, celibacy was a good thing. And so it's adding that layer of understanding that this is a big deal and that for some people it's not for them and that that's okay. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pray. Father God, I thank you for walking with us through this heavy topic. Father, I pray that your heart was conveyed through all of this, and that your people will look back to you in your ways for evaluating all of these things and for thinking through all of these things. And that I pray, Lord, that your people keep you at the center of seeking to understand all of these things properly. Father, I pray for anybody who has experienced these things. Lord, this is a heavy thing. And I just pray, Lord, for them, for their hearts. Father, I thank you that you actively engage with us as we sort through the mess of life within the context of the kingdom, Father. I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys. Thank you for rocking with me during this heavier topic. If you have any questions about anything that was raised, then feel free to reach out, Joe at buddywalkwithjesus.com. I am always happy to have dialogue about these things. Know that my conclusions have not come quickly. I've done a lot of research and I've spent a lot of time, unfortunately, digging through all of this. So until next time, remember two very important things: that you are prayed for and you are loved deeply. Until next week, peace, y'all.